Good evening. Hope everyone is doing well. Tonight we are learning Maseches Pesachim Daf Pei, and we're starting at the very last of the middle width lines on Pei Dalet Amud Beis, about 10 lines or so from the bottom. Yesterday we had a chakira in the Tanaim about where the Isser of Shviras Etzem, of Etzem Lo Sish Bruvo applies, and we saw 8 different nafkaminas between the Tanakama and Rebbe. And now we're going to see a brisa that supports 4 of those shitas, and then we're going to move into a new sugya for tonight. So it says the Gemara, again, 10 lines or so from the bottom of the page on Pei Dalet Amud Beis. Let's get started. Tanya, we have a brisa, ka'arba aminayu, like 4 of the distinctions that we saw between Rebbe and the Tanakama. The Tanya, the brisa writes, Rebbe Omer bebayis echad yeachel ve'etzem lo sish beruvo. We saw this yesterday, that Rebbe's shita about etzem lo sish beruvo is based on the juxtaposition of the word achila and etzem lo sish beruvo. So he says whenever it's possible for something to be ne'echal, that's when we have the isser of etzem lo sish beruvo. Ala kasher uchayev ve'eno chayev ala pasuk. Fine. So this is a little different than the language we saw in the brisa yesterday. If you're clearly contrasting, if you were to look at this line of Rebbe Omer and compare it to the brisa at the bottom of the previous page, it is quite a difficult line to understand in Lamdas and Chakir. We'd have to spend time on it, which we don't have time for, but it is somewhat complicated. Either way, the Gemara now in this brisa will indicate that 4 of the distinctions that we made are rooted in a brisa. Here we go. First of the long lines. Let's say that there was a momentary moment when it was actually kosher, but now that it's time to eat it, so it's not edible anymore. Then the Gemara says, no, number 1, ein bo mishum shviras etzem. That's one of the shitas that we saw. We're rejecting one of the ika benayhus that we saw, which is that if there's a shasa kosher, so the Tanakama was of the opinion yesterday, the Tanakama was of the opinion that would still have the Isser of Etzem Lo Shish Bruvo. Rebbe held not that way. Here is number 2, the second 2 of the 8 that we are going to quote. Yesh bo shir achila, that if there is enough food, then yesh bo mishum shviras etzem. This is a classic perfect match for Rebbe Yudan Nasi, because Rebbe held that achila and shviras etzem are always going to be in the same camp. So if there's enough food, if there's a shiur of achila, then yesh bo mishum shviras etzem. Ein bo shir achila, then ein bo mishum shviras etzem. Now we've quoted 2 of the chakiras that we saw yesterday. Here's the third. Hara'ui lamizbeach. If you have a piece of the korban pesach that is only fit for the mizbeach, namely the tail. Remember we learned yesterday about the aliyah, the tail of the animal, which is not nechal. The tail of the animal gets put straight on the mizbeach. So that is ein bo mishum shviras etzem, because again, in line with Rebbe's shita, that if the food is not edible at the time that we're discussing, then there's no shviras etzem. And b'shas achila. Remember the opinion we spoke about on Shabbos as well, the opinion that maybe on Yud Daled, Abaye recommended this, that it's possible that it's mutter to break the bone before Yantiv starts. Says the Gemara, no, again in the brisa here, 3 lines into the Y lines, b'shas achila. That's when we say yesh bo mishum shviras etzem shelo b'shas achila ein bo mishum shviras etzem. This is the 4th example. When the food is actually edible at that moment, that's when we say that shviras etzem. But if the food is not edible at this particular moment, then there is no isser of shviras etzem. So again, to review, yesterday we discussed the case in the Tanoim about where shviras etzem applies. Does it depend on its psul status or does it depend on its achila status? Yesterday we saw 8 nafkaminas between the Tanakama and Rebbe, and we just saw a proof of 4 of them in the brisa. We're now going to start a connected but new sugya, about 8 lines or so, 7 lines or so from the bottom of the page on Pei Dalet Amud Beis. Says the Gemara Itmar, always indicating a discussion in the Amoraim. Itmar never means Tanaim. Here we go. Aver, if there is a limb, she'ein alav kezayis basar b'makom zeh. In the place that we're discussing, there isn't a kezayis basar. There's half a kezayis, chatzi zayis. The yeshul of kezayis basar b'makom acher. But in another part of the bone, there is enough meat that is a kezayis. So do we say that the isser of shviras etzem applies by that smaller shiur of food? Yes or no? That's a machlokas amoraim. Rav Yochanan Amar yesh bo mishum shviras etzem. Yes, that even though right here by the place where I'm considering breaking the bone, there's only a pachos mikezayis. But because a few inches away to the right, I see that there's a huge chunk of meat, which is a kezayis or more. So therefore, yesh bo mishum shviras etzem. Rav Shimon ben Lakish says, no, ein bo mishum shviras etzem. We are not mitzaref the 2 pieces that are on the bone. If the makom of the shvira that you want to break the bone, there's less than a kezayis, he says there is no isser deoraisa of shviras etzem. But Rav Yochanan does not like this opinion of Rav Shimon ben Lakish at all. Eisive, asking from the Tanaim, Rav Yochanan, Rav Shimon ben Lakish. Rav Yochanan is asking a question from the Tanaim against the sheet of Rav Shimon ben Lakish. What did Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish just say? That if at the makom of shvira there's less than a kazayis, that there's no iser deoraisa of shvira sa'etzem. So says the Gemara, what does the Brisa say? 4 lines from the bottom. Ve'etzem lo sish beruvo. Pasuk and Shmos. We've seen this 10 times already. We're going to contrast it with the pasuk and Dvarim in a little bit. But here the pasuk says that if you break that there's an iser deoraisa. And what's the drasha? Echad etzem sheyesh alav kazayis basar. Ve'echad etzem she'ein alav kazayis basar. This is an explicit Brisa. What was the whole machlokes was whether or not there is a kazayis basar by the makom shvira, by the place that you wanted to break that bone. Would we say that there's an iser shvira sa'etzem there, yes or no, if there's less than a kazayis? This brisa seems pretty clear. So then in analysis of this brisa, the Gemara says as follows: My ein alav kazayis basar. What does this brisa mean when it says that you will equally be chayiv in shvira sa'etzem when there's less than a kazayis? Ilema de ein alav kazayis basar klal. If you want to say that there's not enough, there's no meat at all, it's just a dry bone. So there has to be some meat on the bone. That's not what Rav Yochanan and Rav Shimon ben Lakish were arguing about. They were arguing about a place on the bone, let's say at the 1 inch marker of the bone, that's where he wants to break it, and there is a small amount of meat there. That's not this. It can't be this. It can't be that there's no meat at all. And Lalav says the Gemara, Rav Yochanan, making his push and his question to understand the shita of Rav Shimon ben Lakish, Lalav hachi kamar, says Rav Yochanan, this must be pshat in the brisa. Pshat in the brisa must be echad etzem sheyesh alav kazayis basar b'makom zeh. Whether or not, let's see, that there is a kazayis in one spot, or be'echad she'ein alav kazayis b'makom basar b'makom zeh v'yesh alav kazayis b'makom acher. The brisa must mean that there's at least a small amount of basar over here with a little bit more over there. So what do we see from this brisa? The exact opposite of the shita of Rav Shimon ben Lakish. Our case that was presented as a machlokas in the Amoraim was a case where the 1 inch marker where you want to break the bone is a small amount of meat. And a couple inches later, there's a huge kazayis of meat, 2 kazayis of meat, a kibetza, a lot of meat. So that Rav Yochanan says there is shvira sa'etzem, but Rav Shimon ben Lakish says there isn't. Rav Yochanan's like, what are you talking about? The brisa we just explicitly stated, not like you, it's explicitly stated that there is an iser deraisa if the makom of the shvira is at inch 1 of the bone. If there's only a small amount of meat there, but a full kazayis later, Rav Shimon ben Lakish can't be right. The brisa is against you. So we skip the words in the parentheses, though it would have fit perfectly, but apparently it wasn't in the Tfus Yishanim. That's why these are taken out sometimes, is because they're not in the old Kisvei Yad. How does Reb Shimon ben Lakish get out of this strange scenario that he's in, where he felt something was so clear, yet there was a brisa that he probably knew, right? It's Reb Shimon ben Lakish. It's not like, these aren't lightweights. He knew about these brisas. So answers the Gemara, Amar Le, as we turn to the top of Pehem and Aleph, how does Reb Shimon ben Lakish get out of this? He says, Rav Yochanan, you totally misunderstood the brisa. Lo, your understanding is incorrect. Hachi kamar. This is pshat in the brisa. Echad etzem sheyesh alav kazayis basar mi bachutz. Now we're learning about flesh that's on the outside of the bone versus flesh that's on the inside of the bone. What's the flesh that's on the inside of the bone? The marrow. Very tasty. That's why we put chicken bones in soup. It tastes very good. There's what to extract from it. So here's how Rav Shimon ben Lakish understands the brisa that Rabbi Yochanan brought as a question against him. Echad etzem sheyesh alav kazayis basar mi bachutz. Whether or not the bone has meat on the outside, or v'echad etzem she'ein alav kazayis basar mi bachutz. Maybe there's a bone that has no meat on the outside, but v'yesh alav kazayis basar mi bifnim b'makom shvira. So what does Rabbi Yochanan say? What does Rav Shimon ben Lakish say here? We're factoring in the marrow, and the marrow is what this brisa is teaching me about. Rav Shimon ben Lakish, he gave a beautiful pshat, and Rabbi Yochanan must be wrong, because this brisa clearly must be speaking about what Rav Shimon ben Lakish says, which is that we're talking about the marrow. Now, it's not clear from the brisa that way. However, the Hatanya, the Gemara, sometimes when you see the words Hatanya, usually it's a question. Periodically, it's not a question, but it's a proof. And this one is a proof. If you look at Rashi here on the 4th line, Rashi says V'hatanya binichusa. This is a gentle V'hatanya. Namely, this is meant to prove Rav Shimon ben Lakish's point. Rav Shimon ben Lakish just wanted to say that we factor in the volume of marrow when deciding whether or not we are able to apply the Isser of Etzem Lo Sishberuvo. So it says the Gemara V'hatanya, what's the proof to Rav Shimon ben Lakish? The Etzem Lo Sishberuvo, the pasuk writes that again, the pasuk in Bamidbar, the pasuk in Shmos. This is going to be important because we're going to discuss a similar pasuk in Bamidbar that says V'etzem Lo Yishberuvo, which was a din by Pesach Sheni. Let's get into the psukim, and this brisa will help us to understand Rav Shimon ben Lakish V'hatanya. We know that Rav Shimon ben Lakish is right because what does the brisa write? V'etzem Lo Sishberuvo, Echad Etzem Sheyesh Bo Moach. If there is a bone that has marrow, Whether or not there's marrow, there still is going to be the isser of etzem lo sish beruvo. What then? If you're saying that no matter what's going on with the bone, that the marrow is it, then umani mekayim v'achluas habasar v'alayla hazeh. What does it mean, the flesh? You already told me that the moach counts. So says the Gemara, no, that part of the Torah, that pasuk means bebasar shal gabe ha'etzem. That's talking about the flesh on the outside of the bone, not the marrow, the actual flesh that we see when we pick up an animal. Oh, maybe we should understand differently. Oh, eino. And maybe the pasuk of ve'achluas habasar b'alayla hazeh is talking about the marrow as well. And maybe we're here to learn something else about the isser of breaking a bone. Maybe we should say that when there's no marrow at all, that's one din. Maybe if there is marrow, we dafka should break it. Ve'al titama, don't worry about it. You're scared about telling you to break the bone. No, it's an aseh docha lo saseh. Sharei yavo aseh v'yidcha lo saseh. Maybe, suggested Brisa, havamina, that if there's marrow, that there's a din specifically to break the bone. Why? It's aseh docha lo saseh. We have a mitzvah saseh shel Torah, teach from the Korban Pesach. If the marrow is the way you're yotzei, the mitzvah deoraisa, the achil of the Korban Pesach, then why can't I break a bone? It's aseh docha lo saseh. The aseh of eating the marrow should trump the lo saseh of the shvira. Now this has a flaw in it, this havamina, because usually when we say the phrase of aseh docha lo saseh, the positive commandment and the negative commandment happen at the same exact second. Now that's not true here, because here when you break the bone, you have a separate step of needing to eat the marrow. The best example, we discussed this yesterday, is bris milah. When you're with milah b'tzaras, if the foreskin, if the orla has tzaras, it's all one chituch. That one cut does two things. It's a mitzvah d'oraisa of milah, and it's overriding the lo saseh, removing tzaras. So this is a very strange havamin in the Gemara, because it's not really aseh docha lo saseh, because the two moments don't coincide. The shvira comes first and the achila comes later. The shvira, which is the lo saseh, comes first, and the mitzvah saseh of eating the marrow only comes later. So the havamin of the Gemara is very difficult. Either way, the Brisa in itself rejects this. Kshehu omer ve'etzem lo yishberu vo b'pesach sheni. Later in Sefer Bamidbar, when the Torah repeats the pasuk etzem lo yishberu, we already have the din etzem lo sishberu here in Shemos. Why does the pasuk say etzem lo yishberu vo by Pesach shen she'en Talmud lomar? I didn't need it. Sharei kvar nemar. We already have a din that says kechol chukas haPesach yasu oso. That however we were going to bring the Pesach sheni, it would always reflect and mirror all of the laws that applied by Pesach Rishon. So what's the point of having the pasuk twice? It must therefore be echad etzem sheyesh b'moach ve'echad etzem she'ein b'moach. Either way, whether or not there's marrow, we have a din deoraisa of etzem lo sishberu supporting the shita of Reb Shimon ben Lakish. That was the first question and answer against Reb Shimon ben Lakish. His answer remains untouched. Here's another question against Reb Shimon ben Lakish, approximately a quarter of the way down, 15 lines or so, down on Pei Hamad Aleph Meisvei. Another question from a Brisa. The Brisa here writes this, it's actually a Mishnah. This is actually a Mishnah on the Amud Beis. We'll see this in a couple of minutes, maybe more than a couple of minutes. We'll see this tonight. It says the Mishnah on the Amud Beis, but we're going to see it here, 12, 15 lines down. Aver sheyatza miktsasa. Let's say at a Korban Pesach, someone was moving around the animal and the front right leg of the animal goes outside of the boundaries of where the Korban Pesach is supposed to be brought. What do we do with that? So what do we do? The Mishnah quoted here in the Gemara says, Choseich ad makom shemagia le'etzem. What you do is, let's say you knew that the first 6 inches of the front right leg was put outside of the boundary. So you take a knife and you cut down to the bone. So you're chotech ad makom shemagia le'etzem. You cut through the flesh to the bone, and then v'kolef ad shemagia le'perek. You cut until you get to the joint that's further out, that's away from the boundary line, and then you cut by the joint. Okay, so let's say you have a 12-inch leg. So the first 6 inches went out. You cut down on the flesh 6 inches, and then you cut away and down to the joint, and that's what you're supposed to do. So asks the Gemara, Akash, I don't understand. 1/3 of the way down. V'amris ever she'ein olav kizayis basar b'makom zeh, v'yesh b'makom acher ein bo mishum shviras ha'etzem. If you hold, like Reb Shimon ben Lakish says, that if there isn't enough meat right here, then there's no isser shviras ha'etzem, then why do we have to go back to the joint? Once you cut away the meat and get down to the bone, then there's no meat on the bone. Then what you should do, why do I then have to peel back to the joint that's further away? Niklof bay, just peel back a little bit of skin. Niklof bay porta, peel back a little bit of the flesh away from the bone, v'nispere, and then break it right there. If Rav Shimon ben Lakish is right, that there is no Isser Deoraisa of Shvira Sa'etzem, when there's no flesh right above that Makom HaShvira, then just break it. What is this Mishnah talking about? So says the Gemara, no, not a good question. Rav Shimon ben Lakish is saved again. Now these two Amoraim lived after him, but nevertheless their answers hold true. What do they hold? Abayi Amar Mishum Paka, we're afraid that the bone may crack at a place where there is meat on top of it. That would be an Isser D'Oraisa. We're concerned about that. Ravina Amar Bekulis, Ravina says we're talking about one of the large leg bones that has marrow throughout, and even if there's no flesh on top, there is flesh on the inside in the form of marrow, and therefore we no longer have a question under Shimon ben Lakish. Asks the Gemara, seemingly out of left field, but it's really not. It'll come back to our case of the animal that's Yotze. We have a Mishnah elsewhere. The Mishnah writes, we saw this earlier in the Masechta, and we'll see it again later in the Masechta. It's not a little bit more than a third of the way down. It's not Hasan. We have a Mishnah that writes as follows: Hapigul vehanosar mitaminis es hayadayim. We have an Isser Derabanan, a rabbinic injunction that if there is pigul or nosar, it makes the hands of the Kohen tamei midrabanan. Why? Why does this have to happen? So let's see what's going on here. Rav Huna veRav Chizda. We have two shitas in the Amoraim. They agree on one part and disagree on another part of this shita. One of them says that we have a concern about the Kohen themselves, that they may have had ill intentions. We'll see what this means momentarily. And one says that they're lazy. Now, Mar Masne Apigul, one person is talking about Pigul and one person is talking about Nosar. Mar Masne Anosar. This sounds a little confusing, but this next line will weave together the previous two lines. Man de Masne Apigul, one of these Amoraim was focusing on Pigul. What was his concern about Pigul? His concern was Mishum Chashade Kehuna. He was afraid, and Rashi brings this out in full color, that Ibnei Ha'eva, let's say I'm a Kohen and I really don't like you, and I'm the one who happens to be the appointee to bring your korban. So if I have a machshavas Pigul, you're not Yotze. So Chashade Kehuna, by Pigul, because it's only based on the machshava of the person who's doing the shchita, so then therefore Pigul is possible. If I'm angry at you, then I could mess things up for you. That's what Rashi writes in Dibur HaMaschel Chad Amri Mishum Chashade Kehuna. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi reads as follows: 2 inches above where we are, 3 inches above where we are. Chad Amri Mishum Chashade Kehuna Shechashudin Lefagel Korban Mishum Eva. So because if I don't like you, I'm going to mess up your korban. Gazra ala Pigul sheyitame es hayadayim. We make it difficult for the Kohen to get out of this, because if he in fact is mefagel, if he actually ruins this person's korban, his hands are tamei, and then he has to go be mitahar yadayim. That's annoying. Back in the Gemara, Uman demasne, the other Amora, looking back at this Mishnah about Pigul and Nosar, where the hands of the Kohen become tamei, he was talking about Anosar, Mishum Atzlei Kehuna. By Nosar, what happens in order to make Nosar? You don't eat your food. Everyone should be eating the Korban Pesach. Don't create Nosar. Lo so sir mimeno ad boker. Make sure that you eat your food. So that's what we're concerned about. Uman demasne Anosar Mishum Atzlei Kehuna. We're concerned about that. That's what they agree to. Each of them agrees to that. However, they disagree to the shiur to which this Isser is triggered. The Isser D'Rabbanan is triggered. Mar Masne Kezayis, Umar Masne Kibetza. One says that the shiur to trigger this Isser D'Rabbanan of your hands becoming tummy is a Kezayis, and the other holds, we don't know who's who, Rav Huna and Rav Chizda, we don't know which one holds what. Umar Masne Kibetza. Man de Masne Kezayis Ki Isuro. The one who says that the shiur for which the Isser D'Rabbanan will apply is a Kezayis, that's because he's measuring it Ki Isuro, the amount it takes to violate the Isser. Uman de Masne Kibetza, and the shita that holds that the Isser D'Rabbanan only takes place when, of your hands becoming tummy, it only takes place when it's a Kibetza, that's because of a side din that we've learned before, Ketum Aso, that a food can only transfer Tuma when it's a Kibetza. So they have a machlokes about how large of a piece of food are we talking about to even have the Isser D'Rabbanan, machlokes Kezayis and Kibetza. Good. That's the framing for our question. Ibayaluhu. Based on that Mishnah, and based on the machlokas Rav Huna and Rav Chizda therein about the shiurim, do we say, Ibayalahu Yotze, if an animal, a korban pesach, was brought outside of its appropriate boundaries, do we say Gazir Rabbanan Tuma Olo? That rabbinic injunction that we just learned about by Pigul and Nosar, do we also have that by a case of Yotze, where a korban pesach, where one of the limbs was brought outside of its appropriate boundaries in the Beis HaMikdash? Mi Amrinan, do we say Nosar de Gazir Tuma? The reason why we had a Gzeira D'Rabbanan on Tuma is the Asi Li'atzulebe, because we were afraid that the Kohen was going to be lazy. Aval Yotze, but in regards to an animal leaving its boundaries, there, that's not a passive act. There, Afuke Bi'adayim Lo Mafkele, no one's going to intentionally, it's only an accident, no one's going to do that on purpose. That's not possible. Maybe we should say, therefore, bi'adayim lo gazru bei. Therefore, there's no lo gazru bei rabbanan tuma. Maybe the Isser D'Rabbanan of Tuma B'Yadayim doesn't apply to the case of Yotzei. Odilma Loshna, or maybe we should assume that there's no difference, and really that Pigul and Nosar and Yotzei, when an animal is brought out of bounds, maybe in all of those cases we have an Isser D'Rabbanan. So says the Gemara, two different answers. Tashma, let's see if we can figure out the answer to our question. We spoke about this already. If there is a limb of an animal that exits, that protrudes outside of its appropriate boundary, so then what's the halacha? We saw quoted in the Mishnah above. We'll see the full Mishnah later. So the halacha is you cut flesh down to the bone, and then and then you peel back flesh till you get to the joint and remove the whole joint. Now asks the Gemara, if you want to say that yes, just like by Nosar and Pigul, there's an Isser D'Rabbanan of Tuma B'Yadayim, so too by Yotzei. If that's true that there's Exer D'Rabbanan, then how does this work? What good does cutting it do? Your hands become Tameh the second it's Yotzei. If it's a Yotzei and you're the Kohen, your hands become Tameh, cutting it, you're touching it. Kamitama. It can't be that there's Nisr D'Rabbanan, says the Gemara. This is in question form at the moment. It can't be that there's Nisr D'Rabbanan of Tuma by a case of Yotzei, where the animal leaves its boundaries to be similar to Pigul and Nosar. It can't be, because if that's true, then what is the recommendation of the Mishnah on the Amud Beis to cut the animal by the joint? You just made it Tameh because your hands have a Nisr D'Rabbanan status of Tuma. Doesn't help at all. So it must therefore be that there is no Tuma by Yotzei. There's no Tuma D'Rabbanan. Says the Gemara, Lav Dafka, Tumas Sisarim he, the Tumas Sisarim lo matamya. An important principle in the world of Tuma V'Tara is that because the cutting is at the level of the joint, and because the joint is an internal part of the body, typically a non-visible part of the body, it may still be that there's an Isser D'Rabbanan, that the Kohen's hands are Tameh, but it won't make a difference here. Because when the cutting is done on the internal part of the body, by the joint, because the cutting is being done there, so that is not Matameh. So says the Gemara, that's a fine recommendation according to some. However, that one limb, while anatomically it's connected, the socket and the joint, however the bones are connected, the thing is, well, technically they're connected, but really they're really not connected. Namely, there is no starim, there is no tumas starim, because the joint is considered to be revealed, because the place at which one limb connects to another is no longer considered hidden. So if he holds that way, it's as if these limbs are separated. Mifrasei from the word mifrash, from the tough and shin, again, interchangeable in Aramaic and Hebrew. How would Ravina then understand this? So says the Gemara, if that's true, we don't have the leniency of the Beis Hastarim to say that there's no Tuma transfer. Now you're just cutting, and there is Tuma transfer because there's no Tumas Hastarim here. So according to Ravina, this whole approach is very problematic. So says the Gemara, let's see, Ella, it must be that Laman Demasni Kizayas to Lesbe Kizayas, it must be that this Mishnah on the Amud Beis is dealing with a shiur that's less than a Kizayas, where it doesn't yet trigger the Isser D'Rabbanan of Tuma. Laman Demasni Kibetza to Lesbe Kibetza. And maybe the Shita that holds that the shiur of Isser D'Rabbanan of a Kibetza, yeah, it's taka true, but what are we dealing with in our Mishnah where it's less than a Kibetza? Could be. It kind of skirts out of the issue. Not a great answer, but it seems to be that the problem is yet unresolved because we don't have a proof either way. So let's try again. 15 lines or so, 12 lines from the bottom. Tashma. Hamotzi basar pesach mechabura lechabura. So let's say that I'm in Chabura, I'm eating in room number 1. Me and my family and one of your families. And then in the next room, there's families 3 and 4. So if I go from my Chabura to your Chabura with meat in hand, says the Gemara, Hamotzi basar pesach mechabura lechabura, af al pi shehu belosase. Even though you violate an Isser D'Oraisa, we'll learn the Mari Makomos this at the top of Pehema Beis. Even though that's true, Tahor. The halacha is that the meat is still going to be Tahor. Says the Gemara, my lav Tahor the Usser. Isn't it true that it may well be Tahor, but it's still Usser to eat? Because maybe when you take out food from one Chabura room to the next, from my room number 1 to your room number 2, maybe it's similar to maybe it's similar to taking an animal outside of its appropriate boundaries. And if so, we still see that the quote here from the Brisa is that it's tahor alma. It must therefore be that lo gazru rabbanan tuma. Maybe therefore we see from Chabura to Chabura that it's mutter. and that's similar to the case of Yotze. That's a questionable assumption, which the Gemara is going to reject momentarily. Maybe we see from here that there is no Isser Derabanan of Tuma Biyadayim by a case of Yotze. Maybe that's what we can learn from the Mishnah of Chabura, where one takes their meat from one Chabura to another. Says the Gemara, lo, that's not at all what it means. When the pasuk says that it's tahor, when the Brisa says that it's tahor, that the meat going from Chabura to Chabura is tahor, it's tahor and mutter. And this is why. The Yotze me Chabura the Chabura, that when one takes meat from room number 1, where there's families A and B, and they take the basar to room number 2, Chabura number 2 for families 3 and 4. I take the Chabura, my food from my Chabura to another place. Lav ki Yotze chutzam chitzaso dami v'lo mafsil. It is not similar to a case of Yotze. You're comparing apples to oranges. It doesn't work. You cannot compare a case of leaving your Chabura and going to another to the example of leaving chutzam chitzaso. They're not the same. Vakatani seifa. But wait a minute. The Brisa ended with ha'ochlo harei ze v'lo saseh. So says the Gemara, how do we answer this question? We still see that there's an Isser D'Oraisa. Bishlam alaman de'amar kibetza de'isbe kizayis v'lesbe kibetza. I could solve this problem for you according to the Shita that holds that the Isser D'Rabbanan is only triggered with a kibetza, because maybe he only carried a kizayis. And maybe the Isser D'Rabbanan of the Tuma Biyadayim by Yotze, the one similar to Pigul and Nosar, does apply, but only when it's a kibetza. But here he's only carrying a kizayis. But according to the one who holds that the shiur is a kizayis, it can't be that you're carrying less than that because you violate the Isser D'Oraisa of going from Chabura to Chabura. So it says the Gemara, Bishlam alaman de'amar kibetza. According to the one who says that the Isser D'Rabbanan of Tuma applies when the shiur is a kibetza, that's the isbe kizayis v'lesbe kibetza. They give a small enough shiur that you violate the Isser of lo sa'aseh Chabura to Chabura, but you don't have enough for the Isser D'Rabbanan of the Tuma D'Rabbanan. But Elaman Amar Kizayis, according to the Shita that says that you're going to be in violation of the Isser D'Rabbanan, that you're going to have a Tuma D'Rabbanan when you carry a Kizayis, there's no way he was carrying less than a Kizayis here because he violated the Isser of moving from Chabura to Chabura. Ma'ika Lameimar. What then must be the case? How would he understand that? And this question is in fact so strong that it upslugs the whole last 20 lines. And here's how we conclude. Ella, you're right. B'yotze b'Pesach lo mibaylan de lo gazu rabbanan tuma. Everyone agrees that yes, it's true. We have Tuma D'Rabbanan by Nosar. We have Tuma D'Rabbanan by Pigul. You want to know, do we also have a Tuma D'Rabbanan by a case of Yotze? The answer is absolutely not. There is no Tuma D'Rabbanan for a Korban Pesach whose arm extends beyond the line that it should extend. My taima, what's the reason why we're not concerned about this? Answers the Gemara. B'nei Chabura's reason heinu mizhar zehirei bei. Everyone is always very careful about this. So we don't need Gzeira D'Rabbanan by a case of Yotze because it's so uncommon. Very good. So then, what then was the question? Someone did ask a question here. That's what the Gemara is framing on the top. Who they asked a question in yeshiva. If they asked a question in yeshiva and it wasn't about this, what was their question? It couldn't have been about the Korban Pesach because we said the B'nei Chabura mizhar zehirei. Answers the Gemara. What was their question? Eliki kamin ba'ilan b'yotze b'kachim. They were asking in general about kachim. Do we say in general about kachim that there's an Isser D'Rabbanan of Tuma Yotze? Would we say that if a regular kachim animal was brought out of its appropriate boundaries, would we say then that there's Tuma D'Rabbanan? By the Korban Pesach, we don't even have a question because the B'nei Chabura mizhar zehirei, people are super careful about the Korban Pesach. But by regular kachim, what would we say? My, answers the Gemara, teku. We have no idea what the answer is. Mirz Hashem will find out soon. We don't know. Sikum hadvarim is as follows. Here's what we know. There's a Tuma D'Rabbanan by Pigul. There's a Tuma D'Rabbanan by Nosar. There's no Tuma D'Rabbanan biyadayim by a case of Yotze. And in regards to kachim in general, we just don't know. Teku. Good. Let's dig into a sugya that we just focused on, but from a different lens. Umotzi basar pesach, we said, quoted earlier, that if one takes out basar pesach, turning to the top of a ham and base, if we take it mechabura lechabura minayin, how do we know that there is in fact an Isser D'Rabbanan to take food from my chabura to your chabura? How do we know that to take Korban Pesach from my chabura to your Korban Pesach, I want to come over and have a l'chaim with you. It's Pesach night. Everything is beautiful. I want to come over and have a l'chaim. Not during Korban Pesach. Sit, eat. Nobody leave. Everybody sit and eat. How do we know that there's an Isser D'Oraisa to go from Chabura to Chabura? Says the Gemara, top line, Pehem and Pez. The Tanya, the Brisa writes, Lo sotzi min habayis min habasar chutza. The pasuk writes, you should not be motzi, take out min habayis from your house of basar chutza, outwards. So we're going to be medayik here. Eimi ela mi bayis labayis. I know that there's an Isser Doraisa to go from one house to another. Mechabura lechabura minayin. How do I know that there's an Isser Doraisa to take meat from my chabura to your chabura, even within one house? Answers the Gemara, Talmud Lomar, chutza. That's an extra word. We didn't need that word. Chutz la'achilaso. You're not allowed to leave the room that you're eating with basar in hand of the Korban Pesach. Isser Doraisa. It's a lo sa'aseh shel Torah. You're not allowed. And then Rami Bar Chama, an Amora, throws in a fascinating wrench. Amar Rav Ami, not Rami Bar Chama, Amar Rav Ami, hamotzi basar pesach mechabura lechabura, eino chayv ad sheyaniach. If I walk from my chabura room into your chabura room, the halacha is that I have not violated the lo sa'aseh of moving meat from one chabura to another until I put it down. What does that resonate? That's reminiscent of Hilchos Shabbos. Hotzah ksiv be kishabes. What does the pasuk say? Lo sotzi. So says the Gemara, that word lo sotzi is hotzah ksiv be kishabes. It's the same dinim. Ma Shabbos, 6 lines down, Pehemah base. Crazy. Ma Shabbos ad avad akira vehanacha. Just like by Shabbos, the only time you violate carrying on Shabbos is when you have an akira in one rishus and a hanacha in another. Af hachanami ad avad akira vehanacha. The same is true here. If I go from my chabura to your chabura with Korban Pesach, I have not violated the Isser Deoraisa of moving my chabura to the chabura until I put the meat down. If I sit down at your table and put my plate down, that triggers the Isser Deoraisa. Dome, similar to the halachos of Shabbos, a wild idea. Nevertheless, it's ladina. That's how we paskin, that a chabura mechabura, if I go from my house to yours, am I allowed to walk around with my plate? Social eating, I'm just walking around with my plate. I want to come say hello to you. Really, you should stay where you are. If you do put your plate down, it's an Isser Doraisa, you're not allowed to do that. Unbelievable overlap of halachos. Where does Hilchos Shabbos come into the eating a Korban Pesach from one chabura to another because of the word lo sotzi? The whole Torah is a web of information. Let's continue. 8-9 lines down. Behemoth Beis Masiv Rabbi Abba Bar Mamil. Hayu Sovlin Osan B'motos. Let's say that people were carrying an animal. The way Sovlin Osan B'motos means they were carrying the animal on 4 poles. Heavy animal, they're carrying it. Harishonim, the people who are on the front, who are walking out, Yatzu Chutz L'chomas Ha'azara. Once they go out of the walls of the Azar, V'achronim Lo Yatzu, at that one moment where the front 2 guys holding the front 2 poles are outside of the walls of the Azara, and the back 2 are not, the halacha is Harishonim Mitamin Begadim, V'achronim Ein Mitamin Begadim. So one says that the Begadim are Tamei of the front 2 pole people, and the people holding in the back, they're not Tamei Begadim. Why? They didn't put anything down. Why would you say that that's a problem? Answers the Gemara. The question was raised by him and answered by him. Rav Abba Bar Mamel answers, we're talking about dragging an animal. So you're standing on the other side of the line. You drag the animal past the line. Not all of it yet, but the part that you dragged, you're chayav on. You're not allowed to do that. That's why. But the animal wasn't being held up by the poles. It was being dragged. That brings us to a new Mishnah, 1/3 of the way down. We're going to go all the way until 3 lines to the end of the page. Hashem. Let's continue with a new Mishnah. We've already seen this, I think, 3 times tonight. Aver sheyatza mikzaso. Part of the Korban Pesach extends beyond the boundary line that it should be carried. What should you do? What's the solution? You got to remove that part of the body. Take a knife, cut down to the bone, and then and then scale back the flesh all the way back to the joint, and cut over there. With other korbanos, where there is no isser of cutting bone, what should you do? Nothing. Just take a meat cleaver and hack the animal right where you need to. Kotzetz b'kofitz. Cut it with a kofitz, which we've seen this word before. A kofitz is a meat cleaver. Shein bo mishum shviras etzem. The only time we have an issue of cutting a bone is by a korban pesach, but by mikudash, by other korbanos, no problem at all. Everything's totally fine. So however much of the animal, 6, 10, 12, 15 inches of the body went out of bounds, take a meat cleaver and cut it and keep moving. Everything's fine. Now, says the Mishnah the following: Min ha'agaf lifnim kilifnim. From the framing of the door inwards is treated as inwards as it relates to the mikdash. We'll see what this means in the Gemara. Min ha'agaf lachutz kilachutz. From the framing of the door and outwards, it's treated as outwards. But we don't know which side of the framing of the door you're on. The Gemara is going to ask that question. Hachalonos, the windows, ve'ove hachoma, and in general, the widths of the walls are treated kilifnim. In general, walls are treated as inside in regards to the status of location. Now let's get into this. The Gemara here says, I forgot to hand this out. The Gemara here says a crazy, simple 2 words, one that is extremely halacha l'maisa. Here, thank you, if you don't mind. And just leave me one. Thank you. I'll share this with you on Zoom as well, so you can follow along. So the Gemara here mentions something wild, and it's very halacha l'maisa, especially during COVID. So if you look in the Gemara says a crazy line, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav v'chein l'tfila. The same is true for tefillah. What does that mean? Take a look at Rashi, 2/3 of the way down. First Rashi on the Gemara, Dibur hamaschal v'chein l'tfila, ha'omed min ha'agaf v'lifnim mitztarif la'asara. If you are inside the door frames, then you count as one of the 10. V'ha'omed chutz la'pesach ein mitztarif. If you're outside of the opening, so then the halacha is, says the Tanakama, that you are not mitzaref. Go back in the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Rav v'chein l'tefila. Same din by tefila. Upligad Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Follow this. This is a very important halachic issue. Rabbi Robinson mentions this regularly. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Afilu mechitza shel barzel eino mafsekes ben Yisrael avim shebashamayim. You cannot stop people from joining together for a minyan. What is going on here? So take a look in the Shulchan Aruch. This is the Shulchan Aruch Hilchos Birchos HaShachar Simenun Hey Sif Kaf. 4 lines down in what you see on the screen. Says the Shulchan Aruch as follows: Hayu asara b'makom echad ve'omrim kadeshu kedusha. There are 10 people in one place. Let's call it the left side of the mechitza here at Makor. We've got 10 Jews, and they're saying kadeshu kedusha. Afilu mi she'enu imahem. Even if you're not in the same room as they are, magios. Skip the line. Mi she'enu imahem yachol la'anos. They're still allowed to answer. Namely, that's code word for you are mitzdaref to the minyan. Take a look at the Mishnah Brura. The Mishnah Brura by the little star halfway down says Sif Katan Kaf. Says the Mishnah Brura she'enu imahem rotzalomar afilu bevayis acher. You're in another location. Rachok legamre. Even if you're not close at all. Shekevan she'asara ein b'makom echad shchina shruya beinehem. Once you have 10 in one spot, the Shechina is shored. And therefore, v'az, afilu mechitza shel barzel eino mafsekes, ben kol mi sherotze litzaref atzmo imaviv shebashamayim hashochen besoch elu ha'asara. Very powerful idea, and very halacha l'maisa as well. And that's why in shuls like ours, where we're trying to accommodate the right number of people, or in this case, let's just say we don't have enough people for the minyan that we want to have. And let's say everyone's trying to spread out. You got 8 guys on the left side, 3 guys on the right. It's not right. They should all come to the left side because Shechina is only shriya b'neim if you're min ha'agaf milifnim. Only if you're inside the room, you're on the other side of the mechitza, you're not part of the minyan as it relates to the 10. But once there are 10, Shechina is shriya, you can be on the other side of the mechitza. No problem at all. That's Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. That's why if you're on the other side of the mechitza in our shul, you're still part of the minyan. You can't be one of the 10 because that's not a go-rain for the Shechina to be there. But once there are 10 on one side, then everything else is kafta referach. Everything else works out perfectly. That's the shita of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi halacha l'maisa, and that is learned. Can you also be on Zoom? Sorry, what's that?
Can you also join on Zoom then?
That's a great shaila. Can you join on Zoom? That Rav Avaji Yosef has a whole tshuva about this, as do many poskim. The Shulchan Aruch references it also. If between where you are located and the shul, there's a graf shel rei, there's something that's filthy, dirty. Garbage cans are a big problem. So then the post can say it could be problematic. And Zoom, anyways, is that the same thing of answering Kadeshu Kedusha? It's just a replica of you're hearing a replica of my voice. You're not in the room. It's not the same thing. So the poskim do have a hard time with that. I'm not a postik. I'm not posking. Ask your local Orthodox rabbi. Not so simple.
But didn't they have that shul at Alexandria?
Talking about this all the time. There's a Zoom minyan in this shul, say Kaddish over there. These are shilas to be asked to poskim rabbanim chashuvim. I don't know the answers to that. But anyways,
did they have a shul at Alexandria?
What?
That they used to wait. You had a shul in Alexandria. They used to wave flags to answer amen, so you couldn't even really hear them.
That's true, but that already makes more sense in this regard. That's a different question of shmiya. But there you could be mitzdarif as long as there's nothing that's blocking in between of you. That's kikraf shel rei, anything that smells terrible or that is disgusting. Okay, let's continue. We got to get to Marav in a couple minutes. So says the Gemara as follows. Yes, we learned that from our Mishnah. Now let's get back into our sugya. Hagufa kashya. We have a stira within our Mishnah. Amris. It says in our Mishnah, min ha'agaf v'lifnim kilifnim, that from the doorway and inward is like inside. What about the doorway itself? Ha'agaf atzmo kilachutz. That implies that the doorway itself is outwards. That is the implication. And then the exact opposite implication was said a line later. Ema seifa, min ha'agaf v'lachutz kilachutz. You said from the doorways, from the framing outwards is like outwards. Ha'agaf atzmo kilifnim. So we have opposite implications in our Mishnah. The Reisha implies that the agaf, that the door frame is outwards, and the Seifa implies that it's inward. Lokashia says the Gemara, it just depends which doorways we're talking about. The Mishnah intentionally left opposite implications. Kan b'sharei Azara, kan b'sharei Yerushalayim. It depends. The Sharei Azara and the Sharei Yerushalayim have different dinim. Which one is which? Let's continue reading. Tamar Reb Shmuel bar Yitzchak mipnei ma lo niskatru Sharei Yerushalayim. The gates of Yerushalayim are not considered kadosh. That agaf, you have to be inside the frame. You cannot be in between the frame, under the mantle. You have to be inside the. Why not over there? Because those who have tzaras, who were kicked out of the machane, they would use that to protect from the rain. They'd use some of the shade because they weren't allowed in the machane, so they were outside. So that's why it wasn't considered kadosh. Specifically the shar of Nikanor. Why was that shar? One of the sha'arim by the mikdash. Why was that shar Nikanor? Why was that not considered to be mukdash? Mipnei shemitzoraim omdin sham umachnisin behonos yadam. Remember, bohen yado hayamanis, bon raglo hayamanis. All of the ways that the mitzorah would become Torah. That door also, Shar Nikanor, was also not considered to be a place that was kadosh. And if you were underneath that mantle in that doorway, that sha'ar in the shar itself, you were not considered to be part of the mikdash. That would not count because the mitzorah would use that. We're going to stop right here. Mir Hashem will pick up tomorrow night with Hachalonos, 3 lines from the bottom on Pehem and Beis. Wishing you all a beautiful night.
Can you be